Good morning, everybody. It's so nice to see all of you here. I'm Margaret Lowe-Smith. I'm president of the Atlantic Live. That's the events division of the Atlantic. And you are here for our City Makers Summit. We were just talking about what a hearty group you are. I'm impressed to see so many people here in the rain. I was also told that I should feel glad that it's not 55 as opposed to 75, which it is today. Anyway, thank you all so much for being here. Today we're going to talk about the role that businesses can play in improving the quality of city life. They drive the economy, they provide jobs, and in this city, like many cities, businesses large and small are teaming up with government, nonprofits, community leaders in an effort to tackle some of the biggest issues of our time. So among the questions we're going to address today, does business have a responsibility to do good, to help solve the big social problems of our time? Can business do that better than government and still make a profit? And how is all this working anyway? Today we'll hear from entrepreneurs, city and civic leaders, academics, as well as businessmen and women who are thinking seriously about all these questions. Before we roll, I want to thank JP Chase, our underwriter, for making this gathering possible. And on that note, I'm so pleased to introduce JPMC's Midwest Managing Director of Corporate Responsibility, Daniel Spray. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Margaret, and good morning, everyone. And thank you to the Atlantic for hosting such a great event in a city with such a deep history and commitment to giving back to communities and neighborhoods. Perhaps I'm biased because I lived in Chicago for almost 30 years, but Chicago, I think, is the perfect place to host this conversation about how the private sector can join together with civic leaders to create new approaches to economic growth and opportunity that reaches across communities. As we all know, this is a very diverse city, with a wide range and variety of organizations committed to creating impact, all of who bring together different strategies to try to make it a greater city. We at JP Chase are deeply committed and invested in this community and remain focused on expanding opportunity through our key areas of focus, which is workforce readiness, how we can support small business growth, community development, and then finally, encouraging people to create more financial health and well-being in their lives. Last year, we deployed over $16 million in our philanthropic resources to partners throughout the Chicagoland area and throughout the state of Illinois, and an additional $255 million in community development lending and financing. We're pleased so many of you are here with us today. Here in Chicago and in countries around the world, JP Chase has shifted our work dramatically over the past 3 years to have a different approach toward philanthropy, one we believe is more effective and more impactful, and one that we hope can create models that others learn from. This shift encouraged us to make a $1 billion 5-year investment globally focused on major economic and social challenges by expanding economic opportunity and hopefully driving more inclusive economic growth. Unlike traditional models of philanthropy, we now rely on robust data and research. From our own data, looking at the finances of our nearly 50 million household customers, to analysis of real-time labor market data. We launched a skills gap report last July, specifically focusing on, what's the disconnect between demand and supply in the middle skill job space. We have many partners in the room that assisted us with that work. We believe that innovative new approaches like our Pro Neighborhoods initiative that you hear more about this morning combine vigorous resource data, collaboration, and neighborhood-focused strategies that can create new pathways for growth that will help lift up our communities. You can also read more about our partnerships. We'll have corporate responsibility copies of our report in the back of the room. Together, I think we can explore new ways to solve the pressing issues that confront us. This is what we do at JP Chase, and this is what we know you do each and every day. I want to thank the Atlantic again and invite Margaret back up to kick the morning off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. A few practical notes before we get started. We are on Twitter, of course, Atlantic_live. To join the conversation, use the hashtag CityMakers. We're going to open the floor to questions after each session. We want all of you to be as much of the part of the conversation as you can be, so don't be shy. And now we should get rolling. Chicago's particular challenges are well known to all of us. And like many cities, the public schools here are under duress, the crime rate is high, so is unemployment. Part of what we'll look at today is what role businesses can play in addressing some of these major issues. Deputy Mayor Steve Koch had a long career in business before he landed at City Hall. So this gives him the right constellation of experience to kick off today's forum. And here to lead the conversation is my colleague, the Atlantic's Washington editor-at-large, Steve Clemens. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Margaret. Good morning, everybody. Hello. Special hello to the front row people. Hello, front row people. It's great to be back here. Mr. Deputy Mayor, it's so good. If you're an Atlantic editor and going to do a takedown story on the management of Chicago, what would you start with?
Wow. A takedown, in other words, a negative story?
Well,
which of course you would never do. But if you were to do that,
I'm putting you in my shoes.
I think, look, I think Chicago is, first of all, let me start by good morning, everybody. Welcome to Chicago. For those of you who aren't here, we appreciate your being here. You're helping the economy, so that's a good thing.
Yes.
Hope you stay.
And thank you. And so back to the bad things.
Yes, so back to the bad things. I think Chicago has the same set of issues that most big northern industrial cities in America do. Some we have worse, some we have better. We have many assets. We've got, all of the social pressures that have come about over the last 30, 40 years, and they seem to be, I think, reaching a crescendo right now. And if you look at, sort of the big central issues that a city faces, and if you think about the critical things that are part of somebody's life, education, public safety, economic opportunity, and I think those are sort of the big urban issues of our time. We have great strengths, we have some weaknesses, but I think in the end we have the same set of issues that almost every city faces, and the real question is how does each confront them and who does a better job addressing those challenges in this particular era.
This is a City Makers Summit, and it occurs to me you have one of the most interesting backgrounds of a deputy mayor, because you were not sort of a permanent civil servant of the bureaucracy that rose up. You were sort of a Donald Trump-like guy. It's on the cover story.
That's what people tell me.
You come out of M&A, you did global M&A.
I read this last night. Yeah. For those of you who haven't read it, it's a little bit scary. It's a little scary. Yeah. The mind of Donald Trump, which we've wondered what that is.
Right.
But it's an odd psychological profile that I hope no one ever does on me, because God knows.
We'll take that under advisement.
That. Yeah.
40% of the audience is for Donald Trump, 40% is for Hillary, and 20% is unsure. Or maybe 20% is for Bernie, and then another 20%.
You're in Chicago. Nobody
in any
admits
case,
to being a Republican.
But I guess the question I want to pose is, one of the things that Trump talks a lot about is basically redoing deals, negotiating deals differently, negotiating debt differently. And I'm interested in your experience as an M&A guy who merged things together, who bought assets and who get rid of assets.
Yeah.
What of those skills are relevant running a city like Chicago with so many legacy and stranded costs that are hard to just shake off?
Well, I think on one level, it's an incredibly naive, narrow, and somewhat silly view of government and of governance. And on another level, I think there are some skills there, that at least the kernel of skills that are useful and productive. And let me parse that out. I think on the skill level, I don't think it's necessarily out of a business background or a deal background, whatever that is, that you get this, but I think there are various backgrounds that tend to give you analytical skills, an ability to look at things dispassionately, an ability to sort of understand the core underlying set of issues that might be driving a problem. And those are very useful. They could come out of a lifetime of government, they could come out of a lifetime in business, they might come out of somebody who I guess was a real estate developer, maybe. But I think there's a set of skills that are going to be useful that are a component of what goes into successful governance. I've been doing this not that long, about 3.5 years, and I think my own sort of experience has been that the difference of a public life as opposed to a private is the sort of level of complexity is amped up to a very high degree. just multiple layers of constituencies and complexity that go into public decision making that really aren't part of even the most complicated of business situations. If I think about the most complicated transactions I ever worked on, and I spent 30 plus years doing this, so had all kinds of different things like that, you still had relatively defined sets of constituencies, defined sets of problems that each of them had. And as a general matter, you could address most of those, and that's what led to a successful transaction. The difference in, I think, the public sector is there tend to be winners and losers. There tend to be people who aren't going to be satisfied, particularly in many issues where they're very passionate, deeply held emotional and ideological feelings about a decision. It's just a different process, and there's many more things to satisfy. There's much greater complexity. Maybe that background is useful. I hope we don't find out, but we'll see.
You joked with me in the green room a minute ago that I said, $1 a year. His salary is $1 a year. It means that was very good at his last job. And you said maybe we're being paid too much because of the way things are going right now. And not to dwell on that, but in a more constructive way, in taking a city like Chicago, which is one of the major leading lights, one of my favorite cities in the nation, how do you approach? You deal with finance, you deal with inclusion, you deal with so many of different levels of trying to change the climate here so that it's more welcoming, inclusive, that you've got more equitable investment. How do you think, how does this tick in your head? How do you move the needles that most matter and not just get distracted by many of the things that aren't contributing to that?
Well, look, I think the mayor, when he took office, was very clear and had a very clear vision of what mattered and what mattered in driving a city forward. And it really was those three things that even 5 years in, he's still very focused on: education, economic opportunity, and public safety. And as those sort of core essential services that sort of lead to a virtuous circle of making a place people want to be. Ultimately, to succeed as a city, how are those things going?
Like the public safety thing.
I think there's a mix. Public safety is probably, first of all, they're all deeply interrelated to a degree that I don't think has been historically understood or appreciated and focused on in that way. So the reality is, if we aren't doing a good job in terms of economic opportunity throughout Chicago, in all neighborhoods, and in all walks of life, then public safety is threatened. If you're not doing a good educational job, if you have an education system that fails a segment of the population, and that doesn't lead to them being able to take economic opportunity, that's going to circle in a downward spiral in terms of public safety. Equally, if you do the right things, and if you fix public education and you lead to better results, say in K through 12, and then you extend that into a successful city college or university system, and that leads to a better prepared workforce that is actually engaging in the economy in a successful way, that's going to lead to a better public safety result, more than more cops alone or better gun control and a whole series of things that are very important, but at the end, I think that circle has to be complete. And that's what we've tried to focus on, sometimes very successfully. I think we've made a lot of strides in the educational realm. I think maybe threatened a little bit by what's going on in terms of funding. We've made a lot of strides in the economic development realm. We've got a lot of work to do in terms of extending it throughout the city. And public safety, it's been an ebb and flow. We've had some very good periods in which the city's been as safe as it's probably been in the last 30 and 40. And I think we've had some periods where it's been tougher.
When you look at your morning dashboard, do you have a dashboard? Do you have sort of a data, like how many fires there are, how many? Because I asked Raman this once, and he says he's a data dashboard kind of guy. And
he is more than I am.
You are.
I think, and it's sort of just a difference in personality, particularly in what I do.
So you're not a data guy, and he is?
No, I am, but I think less of day to day. I think in what I try to do and what I try to focus on, and maybe provide a bit of a, be a useful counterpoint or a useful aid to him, is to take a slightly longer view, and I can. I'm not elected. I don't have to worry every day.
You're like Michael J. Fox in that old sitcom, right? That when Michael J. Fox was deputy mayor of New York, and you have the real power, right? Not accountable, and
I don't even remember the show.
Oh, I do. I watched it last night just to get ready for this.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Better than watching Boss or Veep or Parks and Rec.
Yeah, exactly.
That's probably more real life.
I am interested in dashboards. I've asked a number of mayors about them because it gives a sort of sense of how they prioritize, the different tasks. Like Mayor Mike Rawlings of Dallas, on his dashboard that he's having created, he interestingly has property values as part of it. And looking at the south of Dallas, much like the south of Chicago, which hasn't been has been underdeveloped, underinvested in, and as he sees, prices rise, he knows something is beginning to go right. But in the dashboard, it's not all government that runs a city. Private firms, corporate investment, corporate partnership play a role. And I'm trying to ask a question that's not a feel-good question here, because you could say, oh, how's the corporate community in Chicago? Tell me about what's not good about the corporate community in Chicago. What are they not doing that they ought to stand up and do?
I think I'd start with a different spot, which is Chicago is enormously blessed with probably, and I've spent time working in almost every major financial capital in the world on transactions at various points in my career, and Chicago is unique. I've never experienced anything else like it in terms of the close interrelationship and working relationship between business, government, and the public sector, the nonprofit sector. And it's really quite remarkable, an unusual degree of cooperativeness and a sense of civic engagement. So we start with that. The reality is business has, and in particularly if you look at it over the last 10, 20, 30 years ago, a large corporation in Chicago had the luxury of being able to focus on where it was headquartered. Executives lived here. They didn't travel. They probably traveled maybe a day or two a week.
Right.
They were largely here. They lived their lives here. They were likely to stay. They were going to live their whole career with a company. That was their investment and focus. In today's world, if you are the senior executive of a major Chicago corporation, and we're incredibly lucky that it is still a headquarters city. So, and in fact, over the last 5 years, we've had 40 headquarters of major companies move here. So we're still attracting companies to be based here, which is very, very valuable. But the senior executives of any large company have to be outwardly focused, have to be thinking about the rest of the world. They might sleep here on weekends, but the reality is if you're the executive of any big company, you're going to travel 3-4 days a week. You're elsewhere in the world. You have constituencies you have to worry about around the globe. So you can't be as focused on Chicago as you used to be. And we have to recognize that in terms of how we engage.
So you have to differentiate yourself.
Yeah, well, no, I think in terms of how we engage the private sector, what we expect out of them, and what we can use them to do realistically, and how they can engage in building a civil society in Chicago, I think is a little different than it would have been had I been doing this 20 or 30 years ago. My own, I lived here for 30 years and was here on weekends. I traveled 3, 4, 5 days a week. So my business career was really elsewhere in the globe, even though I lived here. And I think that's just not that uncommon in today's world. And in terms of using the business sector as part of sort of growing a better city, you have to be cognizant of the external pressures that exist on them.
So your view then, in terms of these partnerships and civic responsibility from the private sector, is that you've already got enough leadership there, that not more is needed, that it's sort of happening in an ecosystem without greater demand?
Well, look, money is better. Send money. Money's good. So we'd love to get more, private sector philanthropy, contribution, investment. Time, I'd say we get an enormous amount of time commitment from both the business community and the nonprofit community. I don't know that I'd ask for more time. I think what increasingly is important, and you'd always like to see more, and where I'd say the area that could do more is whether it's investment or in business consciousness of just trying to engage more. Look, there are cities that have done a great job, Cleveland comes to mind, of focusing the business community on buying local. So large corporations who use their supply chain to enhance small business in the immediate community, and we're trying to do more of that. I think that's a very important thing in today's world. I think, the corporate community has to do a better job and can do a better job of engaging the whole city. People tend to be focused on where they live, where they work, where they travel to, but they probably don't think as much about the parts of the city that aren't part of their immediate realm. And that's a huge challenge for 5-10 years of making sure that what is successful in a city, and I think this is a challenge that every major city faces, how you distribute of us or even the surrounding area, and there's enormous economic vibrancy and activity happening there. My challenge, and I think the challenge of any great city, is to figure out how to engage all to go, and that's where we're really trying to focus for years.
I guess my last question, I'll go to the audience for a question or two, is about that full city. And let's just be blunt. The black community and the Hispanic community in Chicago were upset with the mayor over an interim police chief. You've been working hard to help the black community have greater access for small business support and small business funds. Why is all of this in the realm of identity sort of getting addressed now? How is this legacy of bias in the system produce such crappy results over such a long period of time and I guess the deeper question is, what do you do about it that doesn't look fake, artificial, and token?
Look, you're more of an expert in this than I am. I just, as an observer of national politics and local politics, would say we seem to be in a moment where identity has bubbled up to a much greater degree than it might have been 5 or 10 years ago, and people come from a spot of identity and say, that leads me to have this problem or want to be recognized. So we're dealing with that the same way most of the country is. You look at it in the presidential race or in any of our national political issues, it's very much a point. We have our own unique Chicago issues, which is historically Chicago has had a relatively high degree of residential segregation. I'd say we've had a slightly lower degree of economic segregation, but a very high degree of residential segregation. That's led to some persistent, very difficult social ills that we have to confront and we have to do better and we have to address. If we don't, we will fail.
Do you feel it's happening?
I think it is happening. I think it's happening just slowly, and it happens too slowly for any normal person's patience. And I just don't think we have a ton of time. There's an enormous urgency to get this right. And, I was struck by when somebody was talking earlier, they said Chicago has the same issues of, unemployment. Chicago actually has a relatively low, in fact, I think we still have the lowest unemployment rate overall of any major American city. But that data really hides the real problem. We have a terrific, very good employment situation in certain parts of the city and an abysmal and unconscionable unemployment rate in other parts of the city. So until we do something to do a better job of including all neighborhoods, everybody in the Chicago economy, then we're going to have a real problem.
Fascinating. Let me take one question. If we've got a question in the audience, we're right out of time here. Where's Christy Hefner? Right there, Christy.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, but you're...
All right, I will ask.
But I know you, and I know you're out there, and the world is watching, Christy.
So I think one of the challenges that government faces is the difficulty that voters have in distinguishing between investment and expense. And as you were talking, Steve, about one of the things you try and do as a ballast, establishing a reasonable time horizon that in the private sector you would have for investment and return on investment. What do you think both the business community and government can do better to help set that table in a way that, whether it's a decision like the parking meter decision, or whether it's a decision about not understanding the deferral of pension liability problems, we are more likely to get better outcomes because voters are more likely to understand what's at stake.
Or broad infrastructure. We have about 45 seconds. So.
Wow, in 45 seconds? I think it's actually incredibly simple and incredibly difficult. Most people don't pay enough attention to politics, public life, to elections, and they do not hold public officials accountable. And the reality is there's an enormous reward in American public life for being short-sighted. for giving candy now and not worrying about the cavities later. That's reality. That is what happened in Chicago. For many, many years, we didn't pay our bills. It's not overly complicated. You have to pay your bills eventually, or else you're going to hit the wall. We hit the wall. We're dealing with that now.
Just as we close, Steve, if again, in the spirit of the city maker's idea, I've often thought about if we were to build a city from ground up today, and you were able to change any particular thing, we just made you all powerful, either within the city bureaucracy or within the way the city was designed. What's the biggest thing you would shift, given what you now know about running a place like this, that would make it better?
Wow. I don't know. You know, I'm not sure I would shift anything, because I have become a believer that sort of the intense planning and intensely planned communities aren't actually places I would want to live. I don't want to live in, you know, Celebration, Florida, or these like perfectly manicured. The chaos of cities, the sort of
Embrace
richness
chaos.
of, you know, the
That's
layers that
tweetable,
come over
folks.
time. I think
Embracing
are what make a
chaos.
city fun.
Yeah.
Would you really want to live in that sort of
Not
well-planned
at all.
world? No.
Margaret Lowe Smith knows I wouldn't. Ladies and gentlemen, Deputy Mayor Steve Koch, thank you so much. That was fun.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Steve. We hear the term corporate responsibility a lot these days. We'll probably hear it a lot over the course of the morning. And one of the things we want to do today is examine what does it really mean. And we have several people here to help answer that question for us. Among them, Walker Smith. He's executive chairman of the Futures Company. That's a global marketing insights and innovation consultancy. And the Future Company issued a report that examines what corporate responsibility means to consumers. Brigitte Witt is Vice President of Corporate Responsibility for Hyatt Hotels, and Jessica Drost-Yagen is CEO of Impact Engine, an investment fund that helps businesses address the world's social and environmental challenges. And they're here with my colleague Alex Wagner, editor at Atlantic Senior Editor. Alex, everyone.
Oh, my husband wouldn't be happy about Alex Weiner. Actually, I wouldn't be happy about Alex Weiner. Thank you guys for joining me. I'm really excited about this topic of discussion because I feel like it's one of the most interesting, relevant, and provocative as we think about business in the 21st century. And Brigitte, let's start with you because you're at Hyatt and you're sort of at the forefront of this. I want to start with this sort of philosophical question almost, which is businesses clearly have a responsibility to their boards, to their shareholders, to their investors. But do they have a responsibility to society? And if they do we need sort of formalized accountability measures on that front?
Well, I think at Hyatt, our corporate sustainability platform is called Hyatt Thrive. And the reason why we chose that name is because we have 600 hotels in over 50 countries around the world. The health and the vitality of the communities that we're in is absolutely integral to our business.
Can you go back from there though? I mean, this is a fairly new endeavor if you look at the Hyatt's history. Can you ever come back from corporate responsibility?
Can you stop doing
Yeah.
it? Is that the question?
Yeah.
I don't think you can. You know, I get asked the question a lot: is corporate responsibility a buzzword? I don't believe it is. I think, you know, do people ask chief marketing officers of companies, is marketing a buzzword? I don't think so. I think people understand and believe that it's integral to the sustainability of a business, marketing is. And I think corporate responsibility is as well. And I think more and more it's being seen as a mainstream and critical component of doing business, especially in a world that's becoming increasingly resource constrained, in a world where there's increasing social unrest, where there's growing inequality. Being able to fill those gaps and address those issues isn't just something that's the right thing to do, it's also important to our business.
Let's talk about the sort of motivations behind that, Jessica. And I'll just put it bluntly. Is it altruism or is it guilt that pushes a company to do this?
It should be neither, I think. It should be in the interest of the business. You know, so my job actually prior to Impact Engine, where we invest in for-profit startups that are making the world a better place, where business is aligned with social good, was at McDonald's leading sustainable sourcing, which is, sort of could fall under the corporate social responsibility name, but in reality, think of sustainability as like a literal term, right? If you want your business to be around, in McDonald's case, for another 60 years, you need to make decisions for the future, not just for the next quarter, right? And so a lot of the things that happen, whether it be sustainable sourcing or more energy efficient buildings or treating employees well, et cetera, when you really think about it, it's about the sustainability of your business. So I don't think it was a guilt or altruism. It's about being good, sustainable business leaders.
That idea, Walker, of sustainability as kind of an existential proposition is kind of a long view on this, right? Like if you want to be McDonald's in 60 years, which is to say still producing food for a lot of people, you've got to make these changes. But it also comes down to sort of consumer interest in corporate sustainability. How much does it matter, and who does it matter to if a company is engaged in corporate responsibility?
Well, so if you look at consumers, there are some people who are very enthusiastic and very engaged in issues related to the environment and sustainability, and for them, they'll pay for it at all cost. But that's a very small percentage of people. Everybody else is kind of looking for what's in it for them. And when you think about consumers, you have to understand that this is kind of a complicated issue in trying to understand where their headset is about these topics. We think about it in two ways at the Futures Company. First, when it comes to issues like sustainability, we look at people as citizens and we look at people as consumers. And when people make decisions as citizens, they're in a different kind of mindset and using different criteria than they are when they're making decisions about consumption. And what it comes down to for particular brands and particular categories is kind of the second thing that we look at, which are reasons to buy and reasons not to buy. So the process that people typically go through is they start with the reasons not to buy something, and you've got to kind of get past those criteria. But once you're in a set of brands that are okay to buy because they're okay morally, they're okay ethically, they measure up on sustainability, then I'm going to choose between those brands because they're all the same on sustainability. I'm going to choose between those brands on things that matter to me as a consumer. And so oftentimes we don't see sustainability high on the criteria that people use to pick a brand because it's not a reason to buy, it's more typically a gating criteria or a reason not to buy that you have to get past.
I would assume that the small, you say it's a small number of people that really care about sustainability. I mean, the issues that we're talking about, when you talk about people as citizens, that becomes almost an inherently political proposition, right? How are you acting in the democracy? What are the values at the top of your list and the democracy, and how will you act on those? I would assume the people most interested in this corporate responsibility, who are looking at goods or companies that practice it, are probably going to be young and probably further on the left side of the spectrum. Is that accurate?
Well, when we geographically profile them, they tend to be the stereotype. So they're on both coasts, and they're much more politically liberal. And so that's definitely the case. Among younger people, there is a lot of speculation about whether or not they're more interested in these things to begin with. This is a generation that has grown up in an environment of purpose. And so this is naturally part of their mindset. It is the way that they have experienced the world as they've come of age. And so they more or less tend to take it for granted. But their process of evaluating whether or not they're willing to pay extra for something that's more sustainable is the same kind of consumer process. You know, sustainability works best when it reinforces the core benefit that a product is offering in the marketplace, as opposed to being something else that you're trying to sell people on.
So Brigitte, but when we talk about this and how relevant it is from a business standpoint, I mean, well, actually, let me backtrack a little bit. If we're talking about at the root of corporate responsibility is a set of values, right? And we talk, and the words that we've thrown around today are, environmental stewardship and sustainability. I mean, some of those, and I'm saying this against the backdrop of 2016, are partisan values at this point. And I guess from a business standpoint, how do you deal with people inside your company who may not share the values that are foundational to corporate responsibility?
Yeah. Well, we have a lot of stakeholders at Hyatt, right? We have colleagues, we have our owners, we have the people in the communities where we operate, we have our shareholders, and my finding is that it's important to all of them, but for very different reasons. Reputation is a huge driver of corporate responsibility, at least for Hyatt. Meaning that our shareholders want to make sure that the company that they're investing in has responsible business practices in place, right? Because I can give you a great example. It was shareholders at Hyatt that first brought the issue of human rights and human trafficking to our attention, and the role that hospitality could potentially play in the issue, and the role and the responsibility that we as an industry have in really raising awareness around it, right? It was something that hadn't crossed my radar when I started in this role at Hyatt. But it was shareholders that really demanded action, and that drove us to really consider the issue and then take some pretty specific and very targeted kind of actions to address it. Our colleagues, I will tell you that they interview us about our corporate responsibility practices. It is important for them to work for a purpose-driven company that has responsibility as one of its core areas of focus. And for our owners, there's a whole other set of dynamics, right? Anytime you use less energy, you use less water, you produce less waste, you also reduce costs, right? In addition to wanting to make sure that whatever brand it is that is on, the kind of the marquee at their hotel or their property, they want that to be a good brand, but they also want to make sure that we're running our business as efficiently as possible. And so I think everybody has a different reason for thinking it's important, but I would argue that very few people think it's not, irrespective of what their motivation is.
Yes, I've reused the towels in my bathroom multiple times, thinking like, I know this is good for the environment, but I also know they just don't want to wash my towels. But that's okay that those two interests dovetail. When we talk about sort of purpose-driven business, Jessica, and you work with a lot of younger companies, why are you seeing young people who arguably want to make the world a better, more sustainable place, a fairer place, a more equal place, why go into business and not, say, nonprofits?
Well, in their case, they're social entrepreneurs, right? Mm-hmm. So they identified a problem, they understand the problem, they have a solution that they think is going to fix the problem. And today, the automatic reaction is not to go start a nonprofit or take that to the government. You start with, well, what's the value proposition for this solution to this problem, right? And you ask yourself, well, then who would pay for that based on that value proposition? And you back into what type of corporate governance structure you should have, right? So it's no longer a values question of whether you should be a 501c3 or an LLC or a C Corp or a benefit corp or a B Corp, there's all these options now, but it's really a strategy question based on who are the types of people that will pay for your product. And it could be the end user, maybe that's a better choice for a for-profit, for instance, or it could be, a philanthropist that wants to provide it for someone else, in which case maybe it's better for you to be a 501c3. So I think in the case of entrepreneurs, that's the motivating factor, is just thinking about how can I be most effective to bring this solution to this problem to the market and to scale it. And it's not always a nonprofit solution these days.
Walker, what are the pitfalls that companies make most frequently when getting into the world of corporate responsibility and trying to figure out a product for consumers?
Well, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. They try to sell sustainability as a reason to buy. So they say you should do business with us because we're a more sustainable business. And so we have practices that are reflected in our employee population, that are reflected in our operations, in our supply chain. And consumers are mindful of that and they appreciate that. But trying to figure out why that matters to me, or why, in most cases, I should pay extra for that is a big leap for consumers. I think companies that have had more success are those that say our sustainable practices better deliver the core benefit that you're looking for. So it's a better skincare product because we've used natural ingredients. It's a better chocolate because we've sourced this from cocoa farms that use sustainable practices. And that's using sustainability as a way of selling kind of the benefit. Another framework that we use at the Futures Company is kind of think of the world and my world. And so the world sort of really matters to my world when you can breach that gap and show me why it matters in my world. And that, of course, makes consumers sound very selfish. and small-minded. They're not. Nobody wants to live irresponsibly.
Right.
Everybody certainly tries to live in a proper way, but people are looking for products and services that can help facilitate that for them, and those products and services have to do the job that they're supposed to do. And sustainability, when it is sold to better deliver that benefit, is when it really succeeds.
I just wonder whether the product we're talking about isn't inherently, and I'm not going to call chocolate a luxury because I think some people use it for basic survival, including myself.
Bad example, I
But
guess.
do you know, I mean, you're talking about a consumer that is educated enough to sort of
Sure.
be concerned about ingredients and engaged enough with presumably the time to sort of focus on the procurement or the shopping in such a way that all these issues come to the fore when you're making the decision in the checkout line, right? So is this field, when you're talking about products, is it inherently narrow? I just worry that, can you do mass?
Yeah. Well, I think so. I mean, I think there are examples of products with scale that have been able to do this. I'm not suggesting that it's easy to scale any kind of benefit in a consumer category. Sustainability as a product element is no different than anything else in kind of the mix of things that you want consumers to pay attention to. But I will kind of add a little footnote to your thought, and that is we're headed to a world of technology where increasingly consumers are going to be using smart apps and algorithms to process all of the information in the world out there. And all you're going to do is specify a preference profile and then let the algorithm do all the work. That's how we're going to navigate the Internet of Things. And in that world, one of the things you may specify in your preference profile is sustainable product. And it'll go out and find the products and then make a recommendation to you. So I think we're actually headed to a world where these kinds of things could actually matter more in consumer decision making than we have seen in the past.
And I wouldn't disagree with that at all, Brigitte, but as the consumer has more information, and Walker mentioned supply chain issues. The question is, where does corporate responsibility stop? At Hyatt, I am sure there are shampoos and towels and soaps that you guys are not producing, but that are being produced somewhere else in the world. And there are a host of questions that arise from the purchase in mass of those products. Labor, sustainability issues, the very same issues you're trying to combat sort of at the top level in the most direct way. How concerned are you guys about supply chain? And is there a point at which you say, okay, this is where Hyatt's corporate responsibility ends?
I would answer as somebody that is in part also responsible for I think maintaining the reputation of our company. I would say supply chain is of extreme interest to us, which is one of the reasons why we worry about some of the things that we worry about, human rights being one of them. We've made a huge commitment to sustainable seafood. And we started in 2014 by first of all banning shark fin in every single one of our hotels around the world. Big issue, huge revenue source for us, right? In Asia.
Shark fin.
Shark fin, huge revenue source. A big cultural item on our menus. You don't have a banquet in Asia unless you have shark fin soup there. But as a company that is purpose-driven, that has made a significant commitment to sustainability for many years, we also had to step back and say, we have a responsibility to do this. We cannot, as a public company that has made these commitments, condone this. And so we not only took shark fin off all of our menus, but we made a very public commitment to source at least 50% of our seafood from sustainable sources by 2018. Very difficult. Very, very difficult to do, because in many parts of the world, we just simply do not have, we do not control our supply chain, right? We're not a Darden, but we've made that commitment, and we're actually making huge strides toward it. And so are we gonna get there? I think so. Will we be in a much different place in 2018 than we were in 2014 because we've made these commitments? 100%.
Do you see yourself as being able to influence the market through these responsible practices in ways beyond just saying, we're not buying shark fin, but the way that you're producing this shampoo, we want you to change your practices in and around the production of that?
Absolutely. And I think what's interesting is as an industry, we're actually starting to recognize that. And we're starting to understand that as an industry, we have a power to move markets. One of us independently, probably not so much, but as an industry we are. And I mean, I think the human rights example that I've cited in human trafficking, this hasn't been a Marriott initiative or a Hyatt initiative or a Starwood initiative. I think as an industry, we've recognized our responsibility. As an industry, we've kind of led the charge in saying we need to have a way to quantify and qualify carbon emissions. So together we came up with a way of doing that. So I think we see ourselves as having a role, but we also think that a lot of this isn't a competitive issue and that as an industry we can really tackle some of these issues.
Jessica, of the issues that there are a panoply of issues to choose from when you talk about corporate responsibility, with social entrepreneurs, with young people, with the sort of forefront of business innovation, the place in which you live and work, what is most resonant? What issues are most resonant in that community? And where do you see the potential for the most growth?
So it depends if you're looking at sort of like specifically the for-profit tech startup space, where there's a much broader community of social entrepreneurs and young people who are going out trying to solve problems. The 4 areas that we focus on as a fund, and those are the 4 areas that we feel there's the most sort of tech startup opportunities in the for-profit space, where big need for society sort of coincides with big market opportunity at the same time, are education, health, economic empowerment, and resource efficiency. And we see a lot of new innovation, being able to leverage technology in new ways over the last several years and sort of moving into the future to change how healthcare is delivered, to change how affordable and accessible financial services are. Things like that sort of all fall into kind of where we see a big opportunity. If I were to take off like a sort of the tech hat, you might have different answers. If you take off the for-profit hat, you might have different answers. So the good news is, and this is actually why I feel hopeful about the world despite reading, depressing news every day, is that there are so many people out there coming up with solutions to problems, right? And I think I get to see that every day, all day, is left and right, dozens of people every day are sending us their ideas for funding, and I'm like, okay, there's hope because there's people out there doing something about it.
Sure, and it's almost where a door closes and a window opens. If one institution seems to be failing, there will be another that enters in its absence. We have time for 1 or 2 questions, and I think we have a microphone circulating, maybe right back there.
Hi, I'm John Ross. A lot of what you're talking about falls under what some people call the triple economic benefit: politics, people, planet. I'm wondering if you also would argue that some of the decisions that corporations make, whether it's around benefits, parental rights, parental leave for fathers, or even like we've seen in North Carolina with the leadership of big corporations against the bathroom law there, if you would tie that into the same concept of people, planets, profit, and overall branding. What do you think of that?
So that is an excellent tee up to a panel we're going to have in like an hour, I think, Margaret, if I'm getting that correctly, about CEO activism. But that's a good question. And I'll start with you, Jessica. Is there a dovetail between CEOs directly getting involved in sort of the political process and shaping change?
Yeah.
Does that dovetail with corporate responsibility?
So I can't comment on the political process specifically because I think that's a strategic question for each company, but I absolutely believe that every company has impacts, right? You can call it corporate responsibility, you cannot. You can have a CEO that just cares about a certain issue. It can be altruistic. However you look at it, every company that exists has impacts. I think what we're starting to realize in recent years is that that's happening. There's transparency about what those are that the world sees and sort of pressures people on. And there's an intentionality about it, right? And this is the same way as we are an impact investing fund. We work with investors that want to align their social returns with their financial returns. And all that is recognizing that our investments have always had impacts. Now we want to know what they are and align them with our values. It's the same as consumers are sometimes moving that way, and I think companies are moving that way. So I feel like the overlap's already there. It's just a question of do you want to direct which way it goes?
Yeah, Brigitte, do you agree with that the overlap is there?
I think there's overlap, absolutely. I think we consider kind kind of bigger issues that are out there in society, always, we really are a purpose-driven company, right? Our purpose is to enable people to be their best every day. And if something really kind of veers from that purpose, we take a really hard look at it, and we do take a stand on issues that we think are important to us and that would veer us away from our purpose.
Walker, when it comes to the consumer, I mean, and we'll talk about this in greater detail, one imagines that the more active a business gets, either on the sort of notion of responsibility or actual sort of politics and policy, on some parts we know that it engenders sort of brand loyalty, but it also, the flip side is that it can further alienate consumers, right?
Yeah,
so how to think about this from a business perspective?
Well, companies have to walk this fine line. They don't want to get involved in partisan political politics. But I do think there is an awakening among companies over the last so many years of who their constituencies are. And it's not just stakeholders, and it's not just consumers, or shareholders, I should say, and not just consumers, but there is a broader number of constituencies that businesses need to measure up to that have an impact on the self-interest of those corporations. Because you can't ask corporations not to be self-interested, but you can open their eyes to all of the constituencies that they need to pay attention to. And I think when we see these kinds of broader issues dovetailing with things like sustainability, what we're seeing is a growing awareness by companies and CEOs of who their constituencies are, and to echo your language, what they need to do to kind of make the markets in which they operate. It's not just selling the products, but it's making the markets that create the opportunities for them.
Okay, we have time for one more. Right over here.
Sure. Rudy Anderson, I'm with the Chess Foundation. My question is, when you had mentioned social entrepreneurism, you said some of the biggest interests were health, education, and economic opportunity. Why would those differ than what you would see in the nonprofit space? Because those have always been the biggest drivers in change. So why would that be more for the for-profit? And why would people be driven into that area rather than the nonprofit space?
So I think it's just partly dependent on who that payer is, again. So I think there's certain types of social issues where a social entrepreneur can have a really unique, innovative solution and want to get out in the world. But let's say, for instance, serving the homeless or disaster relief. Those are things that are very unlikely to have a revenue model, right? A business, aside from philanthropy, right? That requires altruism, it requires supporting, and we need to do that. There are other things like, for instance, we have a company that we've invested in that provides an education technology platform for improving literacy. There actually is a market for education technology platforms. You can grow a business out of it, and actually it's a better way to scale that ability to improve literacy than trying to raise money kind of school by school by school. So it kind of just depends on how the market looks.
The implications, and we have like 30 seconds for this, but I want to get you two on record about this. What are the implications for a city like Chicago when you think about corporations getting this involved in change?
For us, it's really pretty simple. When the communities that we operate in thrive, our business thrives. We're dependent on thriving communities for employment, for investment on behalf of owners. People generally do not want to visit or do business in communities that are not thriving. So for us, it's a business issue as much as it's a philanthropic issue.
Walker?
Well, urban areas are the economic engines of the world and will be so increasingly as we look forward to the future. So for an area like Chicago, it's critical for companies to be engaged in these communities in ways that make them into the kind of markets where they can do as much business as possible. And so I think it is, as I said earlier, well within their self-interest to be very focused on making sure that they are creating a robust, sustainable environment in which business can thrive in this
You hear that, Chicago? That is all the time we have. Walker, Brigitte, Jessica, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Walker, Brigida, Jessica. Thank you, Alex Wagner. Next up, a session presented by our underwriter, JP Morgan Chase, and the topic is the economic revitalization of Chicago's neighborhoods. John Markowski is president of the Community Investment Corporation, which puts money into low-income Chicago neighborhoods. Kristen Faust is president of the Neighborhood Housing Services of Chicago, a nonprofit that provides resources to help people buy, fix, and stay in their homes. And once again, JPMC's Daniel Spray is back to lead the conversation. Daniel?
Great, thank you. So it's going to be a speed round, so let's get right to it. To set the tone, I wanted to talk a little bit. In April this year, JP Morgan Chase launched our Pro Neighborhoods Initiative. It's a $125 million initiative over 5 years, really focused on some of the key challenges that neighborhoods face, gentrification, lack of community commerce. And the initiative really focuses on encouraging CDFIs, community financial development institutions, to collaborate. A CDFI is uniquely chartered to do low-income lending in tough neighborhoods, essentially. And so we had a number of pilot programs that built up to this announcement. And in 2013, we actually put out an RFP and awarded $33 million in grants to 26 organizations across the country that came up with ideas to collaborate. We were very excited in Chicago that 3 of our partners secured a $5 million grant, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So why don't you both describe how your organization serve local communities and how your mission-driven CDFIs?
Me first?
Yes.
All right, so Neighborhood Housing Services, basically we pool public and private capital to create pathways to home ownership. So we coach people on home ownership, we provide classes, but we also make loans, rehab loans and home mortgage loans, and then we help people become civically engaged in their community and teach them how to maintain their house financially and physically, and how to work on challenges and issues in their neighborhoods.
Great. And Jack?
Hi, Jack Markowski from Community Investment Corporation. We're kind of the other side of the coin from NHS. When NHS in residential development in Chicago's low and moderate income communities, NHS specializes in home ownership. We specialize in apartment buildings and multifamily lending. And so we lend money to the people who buy and rehab and own the vast majority of apartment buildings throughout Chicago's neighborhoods, particularly low and moderate income neighborhoods. The other thing that I think both of us have in common is, as Dan said, we're called CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions, and we are generally capitalized by investments from banks. So we have 40 banks that invest in us that provide the capital for our lending activity.
So when you thought about collaboration, what were some of the initial challenges that you saw that drove this collaboration between your organizations?
Well, so this building here, these are 2 flats, and the collaboration was very interesting. NHS and CIC have worked together over the years. Just we complement each other, as I said. But in general in Chicago, I would say we were motoring along pretty well throughout the city, right up to the crash. And to some degree, as we all realize, there was a false economy, there was inflated, irresponsible lending, there was fraud, there was recklessness in the whole financial sector. But on the back of all of that, partially, the neighborhoods throughout the city were doing well. When the crash came, and then the recovery after that, and the crash affected different areas very differently. In some of the strongest areas in Chicago, maybe the market crashed 10%. In other areas, in the low and moderate income areas on the south and west side, the market, the housing values might have crashed 85%, we've seen. I mean, they totally fell apart. And they fell apart, they lost dramatic vacancies, foreclosures, the economy was kicked out of these, the retail stores left, so you had lots of vacancy. That was the main characteristic throughout the south and west side. As we worked on the recovery, we, from our shop, were doing multifamily lending, and as you know, the rental market across the country came back first and has come back strongest. But in Chicago, it came back in the strongest neighborhoods first, obviously, where rents are sky high and there's no vacancies whatsoever. But vacancies characterize the low and moderate income neighborhoods. So particularly with these buildings, these 2 flats, so there's this category of buildings 1 to 4 unit buildings that traditionally had been used for owner occupancy. And that's exactly where all the foreclosures took place, leaving thousands of these vacant buildings across the city, virtually no home buyer demand for these buildings. And as we looked at the neighborhoods, we said, what's going to happen with these buildings? Because traditionally there hadn't been financing programs for investors to own collections of these buildings as well. Oddly enough, it's funny, we all don't realize this, we in housing know this, 50% of the rental stock in Chicago and in the country are actually in these buildings. But this was these 2 flats, which is to give you an idea of what they look like. That was the problem. They were empty. They were out of the housing stock. They were located in neighborhoods that had crashed. Very little home buyer demand, and vacancy was characteristic. So we wanted to collectively develop a program to address this from our various perspectives.
Kristen, any thoughts on the partnership?
So it's like any partnership. It takes a little while, but it's going really great. A couple of things to know about. So we work with homeowners, and homeowners don't want just if there's going to be a rental property next door, the key is that it be a hands-on landlord, a responsible landlord, not an absentee landlord. So we know that CIC works with exactly those kinds of landlords, the hands-on responsible landlords. So it was a great partnership in that CIC also had the ability to come in and acquire those vacant buildings, the 1 to 4s, and then there's a third partner, CCLF, they can provide some financing for developers, and then there's NHS, we can provide financing for the homeowners. And so together, we're getting a hold of the empty buildings, we're providing the financing for a responsible owner, and our emphasis is on home ownership. And then basically what you have is house by house, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, you start seeing a revitalized community. And we have some examples of that.
So we're 2.5 years in. This is, I think, a great example of some of the progress you've made. Jack, you want to walk us through?
Well, this is just an example. So we're across, when you say where do we deal in Chicago, we're primarily, I say, low and moderate income areas, south and west side, but inevitably we end up targeting, and in a good way, target some communities. And because I think one of the lessons here is if there's thousands of these vacant buildings throughout the city, it doesn't do much good to rehab one over here and one over there and one over there. And plus, people don't want to live there anyway. You have to have, I think, a vision of the community, what it can look like going forward in a multifaceted approach. So this is just an example. One of our target communities is in Woodlawn, immediately south of Hyde Park and Washington Park, near the University of Chicago. And we think the Obama Library is going to end up somewhere in this vicinity. But this is an example of just the range of kinds of investments that we make in an area. There's some multifamily loans, there's some single family purchase rehab loans, there's acquisitions of a large Section 8 project on the eastern edge of this, but it's a whole range. There's code enforcement activities, a whole range of complementary activities is what's needed to drive the community forward to a new reality. And in our collaborative that we're working on, it's coming along very well.
And the grant itself, it was a $5 million grant. We've turned that $5 million into $20 million worth of investment into the community. Actually, our leverage is even higher, $1.5 million into $15 million of lending. So that's one of the really great things is the ability for that money to leverage the private sector capital and really reinvest in these communities. We've done over 400 units across the city, and Woodlawn is just an example of an area that we've targeted. You want to see
Oh yeah, sorry.
There's the next picture. This is an example of on the left, what you see is a 2-flat, boarded up, empty. On the right, what you see is the kickoff of a new effort called Renew Woodlawn. And on the right-hand side of those group of people, the far right is Courtney, the new homeowner, and you can see the picture of the house, which is now fully rehabbed. And you want to talk about all the partners involved in that?
Well, yeah, so this is an example. So Kristen and I are working, NHS and CIC, working on the platform of this collaborative program with Chase. But even our collaboration needs to be much broader to have impact in the community, so that here, among the people present here is a representative of POA, that's Preservation of Affordable Housing. They actually got a $30 million choice neighborhood grant in the Woodlawn community to drive, for Woodlawn to drive a lot of it. There's the local alderman. There's the Commissioner David Riefman of the Department of Planning and Development. There's representatives from HUD and the local alderman there in addition. So all of that is needed. And one of the things I would say, we are working now with this Renew Woodlawn program. So I said a couple things earlier. One, there was on these vacant buildings, the 1 to 4s, traditionally they had been owner occupied, but there was not the demand in most neighborhoods for renewed owner occupancy. Woodlawn is an exception to that because of its proximity to Hyde Park, the University of Chicago, the lakefront. We're really giving it, we think there's the potential, and we've committed to the community. We said, don't worry, we're not going to fill your 2 flats with renters and investors. The emphasis is going to be home ownership. And so that's what this program has put us in a position to do that. And I say put us in the position because from our perspective, we've been able to go out with the money we had from Chase and buy the buildings. So that one of the things we're starting the program with is 25 buildings that we've already bought that then NHS is going to be marketing to the homeowners and helping them put together acquisition rehab loans to be reoccupied by home buyers.
We have offices located in the community, and so we source the home buyers and work with them and get them ready for home ownership. One of the things I'd like to emphasize about why do you even need grants? I mean, we're here to help prime the housing market and get it functioning well, so why do you even need a grant to do this? What you have to know about, at least our neighborhoods in Chicago, and it's like this actually in many communities across the country, low and moderate communities, you buy a house for $100,000, you put $50,000 worth of rehab in it, and it appraises at $120,000. So there's a constant gap. There's this constant gap between what the house needs to be fixed up and lived in because of the age of the housing stock and also because of the low appraisal values typically in lower income communities and communities of color. And so we're constantly fighting and trying to fill that gap. And that's why this grant helped us then leverage other capital to come in and always try to fill that gap that then helps us and basically work with the residents in the communities to revitalize their communities.
As I mentioned, we did 2 years of pilot CDFI grants before we launched Pro Neighborhoods. And this was really one of the first, most successful grants we had in 2013. And we were really excited it was in Chicago. You guys were terrific partners.
Great.
And a lot of what you learned helped us create the Pro Neighborhoods program. For those who are interested, we do have brochures in the back that will go into a little bit more detail. And the first year of funding was $33 million, and we had the Harvard Joint Center on Housing and Studies do a study of that funding. And it did bring down an additional $226 million in assets across the country that provided over $100 million in loans. It provided the preservation and development of over 200,000 affordable housing units, lending to over 130 small businesses, and the creation and retention of nearly 2,700 jobs. And so, we think it's been very successful. And again, you were instrumental in helping us launch the broader program.
Great. Well, we're happy to do that. And what was great, I think, about the Chase money too, is it was flexible money. It was, as Kristen says, it was grant money, flexible money. We proposed this is how we're going to use it. We're using it for acquisition. Kristen's using it for loan loss reserves for their home improvement loans. CCLF is using it for redevelopment financing for their pool. So all of it works together, but it really kind of fuels everything else.
Great. So no time for questions with this panel. Thank you for your involvement. We will be in the back if folks have any questions. Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Daniel, Kristen, and Jack. We've been hearing a lot about businesses in the city building public-private partnerships in an effort to solve some of the city's biggest problems. And so the question we want to answer in our next session is, how is it going and what lessons can we learn from the Chicago story? And we have the right people here to talk about this. Derek Douglas, Vice President of Civic Engagement at the University of Chicago. He's leading the university's efforts to rebuild the surrounding community on the south side. Bridget Gaynor is a Cook County Board Commissioner. She's also Vice President of Global Public Affairs at the insurance company Aon. Teresa Mintle is the President and CEO of the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce, and before that job, she was Mayor Rahm Emanuel's first Chief of Staff. My colleague, Steve Clemens, is back to lead the conversation.
I just want to walk over here for a minute and just say thank you, Chris. You've been tweeting a great job. I've been reading. You don't even know me, right? But good job. I want you to know we're watching those tweets. So now we're going to talk about some fun things. Teresa, you were Mayor Emanuel's first Chief of Staff.
Guilty.
Yeah, and you left the job and the place went to hell. What happened?
Now we know.
No, but let me ask you seriously, start here for a moment, that I studied up on Chicago. I thought I knew Chicago well, but I really didn't have a full understanding of how bad things were right now. So crime is up. There's distress with budgets. End of June is another big payday for sort of union pay, and people don't know what's going on. Springfield is a mess. There's a lot of dysfunction. I mean, there are a lot of good stories, but there seems to be a lot of bad bubbling up. And I'm just interested in, given your perspective of both being head of the chamber, but also helping to run the city, what you think about that.
There's no doubt that we're in a very difficult period in Chicago's history. In everything you said, I mean, every day there's a headline that's unpleasant and makes me wince. And quite frankly, we've been here before, and we've always come out of it. And I think the reason why Chicago continues to thrive and survive and move the needle is because we have an amazing business community here. And back to the Chicago fire, even up till today, they always step up to the plate to make a big difference. I get to meet chamber leaders from around the country, and without fail, from the largest cities to the mid-sized and smallest, they envy what we have here in Chicago by way of an activist business community, and I think that makes a big difference.
Let me ask the three of you all together, just chat for a minute, that we've got the University of Chicago and the head of civic engagement, and Bridget, you're like doing three jobs. There's a land bank you're tied into, and a commissioner of Cook County and Aon, but and of course the Chamber of Commerce. And I guess my not facetious question is, how dependent on City Hall are you to actually make the city better? What are the kinds of things that can be done without being so dependent on civic leadership? Let me start with Derek.
Well, I mean, my view of how you work in communities, work in cities, work in neighborhoods is through partnership. Most of the work that we do when it comes to development and whatnot, it involves City Hall. Mm-hmm. You got to go through City Hall to get approvals, the permits, the support, and we try to work in concert. We actually signed an MOU with the mayor just last year, us and 7 other universities across the city, to figure out how the plans that the universities have can work in tandem with what the city has. But it's not just the City Hall issue. I don't think that one institution, one organization can solve all the problems and the challenges that we face in this city. Mm-hmm. And it really takes all of us thinking about what role can we play, and then working together through partnership. So we do a lot of work with the local communities where we partner with various stakeholders and community-based organizations. We work with other universities. We work with the city, obviously.
So make it real for me, because let's say University of Chicago has been here a long time. The Chamber's been here for forever, although you're just the 5th leader of it, so apparently you have long tenures, and companies are here. So that climate and those stakeholders are always here. When do they work well together, and when do they not? What do you need to make that set of characters do something extraordinary?
So let me give you one concrete example. So one of the issues that you have on the south and west side, actually other parts, but particularly the south and west sides, is we need to drive more economic activity there. We need more dollars supporting the businesses, the workers, whatnot.
Right.
At the university, we created a program called U Chicago Local. The idea was, let's think about the purchasing power of the university. Between the university and the medical center, we spend $1 billion every year buying stuff. We said, can we direct more of that to businesses on the south side of Chicago? We brought the idea to World Business Chicago. Mm-hmm. And we said, we're trying to do this in our neighborhoods, but why don't we see if we can get other anchors, the city and other players, to also partner and do it in both the south and the west sides. That led to the creation of an organization called Chicago anchors for a strong economy, CASE. There are 15 anchor institutions, us, Northwestern, Rush, UIC, the city of Chicago's in there, the county is in there, ComEd, Advocate, businesses, the museums in the park. You have a variety of organizations that are all coming together, and we're each asking ourselves the question, how can we leverage our dollars that we spend anyway to invest in businesses on the south and west sides? How can we strengthen the capacity of those businesses to better compete? How can we think about our hiring and do more local hiring, all of which is leading to strengthening the neighborhoods, the people in the communities that need help the most.
And does it feel real to you or token, Bridget?
Oh, it's very real. It's very real because, I mean, to be honest with you, it's not, to me it would be token if we said, let's come up with something we can do on the side while the rest of the institution's going here to help out. This is just about thinking more strategically about what we do anyway. We got to buy the stuff. All those institutions need to buy things. The question is, are you going to buy them from New York? Are you going to buy them from California? Or are you going to buy them from Chicago? And if you're buying them from Chicago, will you buy them from businesses in the neighborhoods and in the communities that need help the most? So to me, it's very real, and it's creating great connections to businesses that we didn't have before. What's also great about the partnership is there may be suppliers that we use that another anchor hadn't used. And they're learning about those opportunities. And now we're also thinking about how we can collectively leverage our collective impact by, if we say have a supplier that's located somewhere else, if a group of us say we'd like to see you located in Chicago, in the South Side, we now have the leverage and the power to help make that happen, and we're having those conversations. So it's not, to me, a lot of this work is, it's not rocket science. It's really about having a passion and a commitment and rethinking what are the tools we have at our disposal and how can we direct them to have
Bridget,
this broader impact.
I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember how quite. You had a program you were working with on job stop bullets, or a job,
Nothing stops a bullet like
right,
a job.
Yeah, job stops a bullet. And you've also worked a lot in the sort of broad question of how to make development move. And I've been interested in this question of this Cook County land bank, and how does that work? What are you trying to solve?
Well, a great question, and I think in some ways it carries off of what Derek just said. And the question of how interdependent are we, or how much do we need City Hall as a first stop? I think his point about the university, everyone has got to kind of know their own power and do their thing the best way. So my first job out of school for about a decade, I was a community organizer, and the lessons you learn there are you got to build up your own base, you got to define your issue, how you're going to move forward, and how to actually get other people to follow you. But you have to have a really clear set of goals and objectives. And this is what Derek's talking about, as far as they're not going to City Hall and say, hey, could you solve my problem because I have to figure this out? And this is the same thing we came about with the land bank. So I got onto the board in 2009, and we were kind of at the end of the foreclosure crisis, or 3/4 of the way through. People calling the office, going through foreclosure, getting letters from the banks, not really knowing how to do and how to react. And so we set up a legal aid clinic at the court. That was fine, just give people a lawyer. Then we looked at the vacant building ordinance that said, we used to have 15,000 foreclosure filings in Cook County every year, and they went up to 50,000 for 3 years in a row. So what used to take 45 days to clear in court now took 800. And it was this crazy situation where you had neighborhoods, Chatham, Auburn Gresham, Belmont-Cragen, who never really saw large-scale vacancies. And all of a sudden, if it takes 2 years to get something out of court, and the banks, were kind of confronted with a situation they'd never dealt with before. Fannie Mae, very difficult to bring along partner. As far as getting out of the, kind of sitting on vacant housing business. So we looked around the country and realized that it's not like these neighborhoods were not desirable, just like there isn't businesses that can thrive. It's that the market wasn't working. Banks were not lending because they're fighting the last war, because they overlent in the beginning. Appraisers are overappraising because they underappraised. So everyone is kind of contracting. So what happens is the guy that wants to buy the house across the street from his mother's house that's vacant can't even get access to that. And so you end up with this kind of excess supply that's sitting out there. When it's vacant, what it's doing is it's kind of leaching out all of the value from the rest of the community. So the goal of the land bank was to come in and say, okay, we got a limited amount of capital from the mortgage foreclosure settlement, but we knew that that was just a runway, and we had to become self-sufficient. So we started buying up 1s, 2s on blocks finding organizations and people. I mean, one of our, I think, my proudest accomplishment is that we have been able to nurture local businesses. You know, people that used to be insurance or real estate brokers are now developers. People who did stuff on the side, we've been able to help them get access to capital and access to housing to actually now become a developer with a full-on business. So we've got now 3 years in.
Do you publish results?
Yeah, we do.
So someone can go out and find out saying, here's the echo effect,
Yeah, we have a great
the impact.
website. You know, that's a great question because there's a lot of ways to measure impact. Part of it is the comps that rise on blocks that we've done work on, which I think is useful. But, you know, 3 years into the land bank, we've got over 8,000 properties, tax liens, PINs into the books. We will make probably close to $10 million this year on our transactions, and we are on a absolutely self-sufficient runway. And it kind of gets back to your operative question, which is you cannot expect government to kind of either define your problem or solve it for you. You can't look to them to kind of, you know, make every decision or kind of be the big main funding bulwark. There are a lot of issues and problems in the city, but there are also a lot of inherent resources. And it's just about, like Derek said, how do you be more strategic in the things that we are already doing? But like I said, for me, it gets back to the lessons I learned as an organizer, is you have to have a clear set of a mission and a direction, but you got to be able to articulate that to people, and you have to get them to be able to be willing to kind of come in common cause with you. Because if you can't solve your problem kind of on your own, and you're always looking to a funder or a government to do it, you know, you might be able to do it for a couple of years. It's not sustainable.
Teresa, in the chamber, in the world, in the business executives you deal with, what is the chatter among them about what really needs to be fixed and done here? What are the, say, top 3 priorities that you're trying to remedy that you think in private-public partnerships you're able to weigh in a constructive way?
There is a certain amount of dependence on the government to get to the next level. And
which government?
City, county, and state. Because for us, the first thing that needs to be done is to really, really address our financial problems. It's the pension shortfall. It is the inability to find enough revenue to pay for government. It's defining what government is and what then we should do to pay for it. So we spend a lot of time on, we have a whole advocacy group at the chamber that works on just that, you know, either fighting one-off solutions to more entrenched problems.
So couldn't they just say, here's a lot of tax dollars, kick in more money and just solve the problem?
The business community? No. There's a better way to do this. There's a much better way to do this, much more thoughtful. And again, back to the whole strategic side of it. So there's a certain amount of dependence on government, because even though we might have a great initiative to stem violence, there might be a great initiative to reform juvenile justice, there might be a great initiative at the local level for economic development. If there's not government and private sector money there, that public-private partnership to actually affect outcomes and have real goals and objectives, then you're never really going to make a difference. So as long as all of our money is tied up in debt service or trying to fund things that we're paying for, you know, generation-old problems, there won't be the kind of resources to match on the private sector. That doesn't mean the private sector is waiting for that. And just as Derek pointed out, the CASE initiative, the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce is the largest provider of small and mid-sized businesses to the CASE initiative to get them into the pipeline. Through our members, our Small Business Development Center, the work we do out in the local neighborhoods. We are not waiting for you know, another economic development initiative coming out of the state, the county, or the city. We're in the trenches working on that right now. And what we've been able to do is leverage our breadth and depth of membership to say that you big guys like the U of C, like Aon, here's what we can collectively do to help make a difference. And it's not just CASE, it's the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Business Initiative. It is Chicago Forward. It is the Export-Import Initiative that we have going on. It's our own Small Business Chicago at the Chamber. We are actually leveraging all aspects of the business sector, large, medium, and small, to start having an impact out in the communities where it belongs. There's a certain amount of having to work with government to make that happen, but if we wait for government to fix its house, we'll never get anything accomplished. But it also means we know we've got to work with government to give them support, backbone, cover, whatever it takes to make the hard decisions, because the decisions are hard.
Fascinating. Bridget, you know, like my colleague Ta-Nehisi Coates, who won the National Book Award this last year, but he's written a lot in The Atlantic about Chicago, about redlining and kind of long-term institutionalized bigotry in the way that this city and a lot of other parts of the country have worked. And I've been intrigued by your hiring practices. They're so different than many other big firms in that you are hiring, as I understand it, people from Southside, trying to get a talent pipeline from non-traditional areas. Now, maybe that was a different insurance company I was reading about, but I think it was yours.
Yeah.
So I don't want to praise you if you're not deserving.
Have at it.
But I guess the question I have here is that a lot of times we talk about educating people, but you know, particularly as this city struggles with its identity and struggles with parts of the town that weren't developed, struggles with over-incarceration in certain areas, and et cetera. Not many people are given a second chance in our economy, number one. And number two, it's not very well designed that people from certain communities are sort of given a leg up. And I'm interested just in the before we go to Derek here for a minute, but in the corporate side, do you find any real change happening? Is the model of what you're doing impacting other businesses? Because it seems to me they're fine taking cream of the crop, but let 90% of the other people that have had a tough system built up against them not give them another chance.
So, yes, so I'll talk about the Aon example in a second, but I don't think it can be said enough of the institutional barriers that we put for someone who made did something really bad, stupid, whatever you want to call it, at 18 or 19 or 22, and this is something I would actually ask everyone here who works at a private sector company, is to call your HR department and say, what is our policy on hiring someone with a conviction?
Right.
Do I have to wait 5 years? Do I have to wait 10 years? I mean, you might be the first person who's ever even asked this question. And then if the answer is more than a couple of years, why? Why is that? And why is it for all crimes? And why aren't we being a little bit more thoughtful about this? Because our ability now to track people for everything they've ever done is, it's creating this barrier beyond which no one can overcome. Mm-hmm. And we're going to end up paying that price on the end, and to say it's completely unjust. But on Aon's front, so we're creating a financial services apprenticeship, much like we see apprenticeships in the trades. And we're going for high school graduates and people who are smart and ambitious and all of those things, but maybe just haven't gone through the gauntlet of a 4-year degree. And it wasn't, and this goes exactly back to not making special pilot programs. We looked at all of our entry-level positions, and I saw Dan Spray from Chase and a bunch of the banks we're partnering with, and CNA and Allstate and Zurich. But we looked at our entry-level positions, and many of them didn't really even require a 4-year degree, but it just kind of, you would over-rotated there because it was easier to hire, and it kind of got you other attributes that you might have liked. So that would be the second kind of call to action that I would put out there for people is, we make the wall so high for people to jump over, and you're really damning yourself because you're cutting yourself off from a really great talent pipeline, right? And you're also not giving people a chance. So instead of kind of forcing people to fit the pipeline, make the pipeline fit the talent
Teresa,
pool that we have.
Is that something that you folks talk about in the chamber?
Oh, we do. Our foundation actually is working on talent, specifically to early getting the kids sooner rather than later. We have 5 STEM high schools here in Chicago, science, technology, engineering, and math, and each has been sponsored by a corporation here in Chicago. This last summer was the first time that the junior class could actually go into jobs. And there were more students that wanted to work than these 5 corporations could absorb. So at the chamber, we took in, I think, 14 of them. We paid for their summer, and we didn't have them running around our office Xeroxing. Absolutely not. These kids were really well trained, and we placed them with our small business clients who couldn't afford an intern. They themselves weren't quite sure what they needed to do to improve their web page or something, and we gave them opportunities. So at the highest level, from Microsoft and Cisco and IBM down to a little neighborhood person who's literally working at a storefront, we gave these people opportunity. And it is a firm commitment of the chamber as well as our individual members to engage in this level of not only backing juvenile justice reform, not only backing programs for anti-violence, but then to turn around and actually say, bring them in. We want to make sure that those kids get the right kind of opportunity. And some of it is really quite striking. 2 of the students did work at our office, and they had never been downtown before. And I actually, at a staff meeting we had a couple weeks ago, we were talking about the fact that we were having more of these students in our office this summer, but we also had a group of high school students come to our office for an immersion half day. And some of those kids had never been downtown before. And so I asked my staff, I said, how many of you have been to Englewood? Works both ways, you guys. So we actually had a program out in Englewood to make sure my staff and our members got down to Englewood Blue, which is an incubator down there. Right. And I think it's incredibly important for us to make sure that we embrace this from both sides, not only bring them into our world, but understand the world from which they come.
I want to go to the audience. I would believe in going to the audience for at least one question, so somebody get ready. But Derek, let me just ask you, you helped bring the Presidential Library to the south side of Chicago, or hopefully it's going there and will get done one day. You told me emphatically it was going there, but we don't know exactly where. But I guess the question is, how do you, I mean, that sounds good to me in one way, but it also sounds a little bit of feel good. So you're going to put a presidential library in Southside Chicago, and it'll be neat. How do you make it not an island where it's a presidential library and really doesn't fundamentally, again, it becomes a token gesture and not something that changes the patterns in the area. Just 1 minute on that.
Yeah, I think that the risk of something like that is if you're not intentional up front, it will become an island. And so you have to plan now. And it takes everybody, the community, the city, the Obama Foundation, universities, who's an anchor there, other county, other partners, to come up with an intentional plan as to how we make sure that the economic development, the investment that comes into the community benefits the community. And we're actually starting to have those conversations now. The one last thing I just want to say briefly is that, and I think this is a challenge for us as a city, that there's a lot of good programs, you heard about a bunch today, that are going on. And what we need to start thinking about is how do we bring all this activity to ground in a particular place to lead to transformation.
Right.
Because what ends up happening, and I saw this when I was in the White House, and I see it now, is that there's a lot of good stuff, but it's spread all over, and you're helping some kids here or there, but the state of the South Side West doesn't add up. And we have to start thinking about how you bring land bank and your programs and our stuff to neighborhoods, get them transformed, and then you can move to other places. But we need that same sort of coordinated strategic vision that was used coming out of the Chicago fire to deal with the challenges today.
We need a Marshall Plan.
Thank you.
We need that Marshall Plan.
What happened after the Chicago fire, and you need a Marshall Plan, those are tweetable. I'm drawn by zingers. So quick question, somebody has a question right here. This gentleman touched his ear. No, okay. Any other question in the very back? It's got to be somebody. I'm going to go to this gentleman right. I don't know who you are, but I'm sure you have a question. Yeah. Who are you?
I don't have a question.
Oh, you don't have a question?
I'm actually very much enjoying the discussion.
Okay, great.
I have a broader question, and
with
regard to the topic and the theme of city markets. Sure. Didn't want to stand up, but thank you. I'm going to stay anonymous because this gentleman behind me is tweeting. But really, I have, I guess, a kind of a broader thought.
Yeah.
With regard to the entire conference, City Maker Summit, where does the corporate responsibility piece start and end from a business size?
Yeah.
Great.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yep, perfect. That's a perfect question.
Balance sheet size.
Yeah, so balance sheet side, 30 seconds each.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I think it gets back to, when I talked about the hiring and talent program, that was something that makes sense for our business. And that's where you've got to kind of stay true to it. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. The leadership changes and somebody's out. Right. You've got to go and say, what are we doing now? What is actually growing our business, which is our main responsibility? But how do we do that with the idea of looking through it as a lens of not just shareholder value, which is important, but how do I have multiple lenses, one of which is how do I sustain the city that I live in, that I hire my employees from, that kind of sustains our business. And so just making yourself have a slightly different perspective opens the doors, I think, to kind of coming up with things that are not just good for the business and good for the city, but also sustainable.
And as you take your 15 seconds each, I'm going to tweak it. As you're thinking through that lens, Teresa, with your members, is there a zero-sum element where if a business is doing well, it somehow has to screw the interests of the city? Or how do you get into that thing where both interests are there? Because what's the protector there? Because there's been a lot of talk about parking meters. I don't quite get it, but how do you get so that the interests of both are furthered and not just on the balance sheet side doesn't dominate the whole picture.
But the interests of both are furthered if you do this right. The 5 sponsors of the STEM schools are a great example. They aren't doing this because someone twisted their arm. They're investing in their future workforce.
Right.
And they recognize that as our city and our country becomes more diverse, they're not going to get all of their future workers out of an Ivy League school who have studied some sort of math, science, or engineering. They're going to get them from the neighborhoods and the community in which they're located, and they're also going to be responsive to that neighborhood because it's a diverse community, and that's why.
Last quick word, Derek.
I would just echo what they say. I think that the key to all this work is the notion of mutual benefit. Looking for opportunities to do things through your organization that benefit your organization, but also could benefit the city or the community. And if we look for those opportunities, there's a huge space, I think, that could lead to significant change.
Thank you for a great discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, Derek Douglas of the University of Chicago, Bridget Gaynor, Cook County Commissioner and Vice President of AON, and Teresa Minnell, Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce President and CEO. Thank you both. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, too.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Derek, Bridget, and Teresa. I want to commend the gentleman in the front row for reacting so quickly and asking a very thoughtful question. That was impressive. Next, we're going to talk about the new face of corporate activism. After last year's Supreme Court ruling allowing same-sex marriage, Indiana responded by passing a religious freedom law, effectively saying businesses don't have to serve same-sex couples if they have a religious objection to doing so. Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi followed suit, and then North Carolina, as we all know, is making headlines with a law requiring transgender individuals to use the public bathrooms that reflect their birth gender. In every state, it was the business community that led the charge against these laws, saying they amounted to discrimination of gays and lesbians, their workers and customers, and those businesses then threatened to move jobs and investments from those states. This is clearly the new front of corporate responsibility, led in part by a major company based in Indianapolis, the home service rating site Angie's List. Bill Oesterle is the co-founder and former CEO of Angie's List, and he's now the co-chair of Tech for Equality, a tech coalition working to update civil rights laws to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Aaron Chatterjee is an associate professor at Duke's Fuqua School of Business. His new study suggests that engaging in hot-button social issues can be good for business, and Alex Wagner is back to lead this final conversation. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Margaret. So I know there is interest in this topic because we started on it 2 hours ago or an hour and a half ago. So let's get right to it. And Bill, I want to ask you, as someone who is at the forefront of the fight in Indiana, on a personal level, walk us through the decision-making process that you went through to take a stand on that issue.
Well, certainly we were building a technology company in Indiana, and I've spent my entire life, I'm a native-born Hoosier, but worked out on the coast, and inevitably we're having to attempt to persuade people that Indiana's a wonderful place to work, and it's got a vibrant technology economy, and it's a great place for families. So we had an insatiable appetite for talent. We were trying to hire globally, and when this issue came up, it was obvious to me that it was going to directly impact our ability to execute our business plan. And then fundamentally, just on a personal basis, I thought it was wrong. It was morally wrong. So those two things, they don't always collide in the way that they did, but in this case, that happened.
Had there been other instances where you'd see things going on that personally affected you in the same way, but where you sort of didn't take an issue or where you didn't feel like it was appropriate?
Oh, yes, inevitably. We had, for example, there was a legislative movement a few years ago to take punitive measures against undocumented workers. We don't have Angie's List did not have a labor force that consisted of any undocumented workers. But to me personally, that was a very important issue. But that was not something that, as a company, we were gonna take a position on. We just didn't have a relevant voice to state anything. So that would be a counterexample.
Ronnie, when we talk about what's happening right now with CEOs functioning effectively as activists, I think back, and Henry Ford famously decried capital punishment in the 1920s, but in the intervening century, we have not thought of CEOs as sort of animated by activist causes. What is happening right now that you think has led to this moment?
Yeah, something is going on out there. If you look at sort of with 2015, where Bill and Tim Cook from Apple and Mark Benioff from Salesforce got involved on a pretty obscure issue to the rest of the nation that really mattered for Indiana, which was this Religious Freedom Restoration Act. The question was, why? Why now? And we started to think about this in our research. And I think there's a bunch of different reasons. One is, this is a new generation of CEOs and COOs like Sheryl Sandberg. The generation that went to business school with Bill saw fundamentally different courses. They thought about the social impact of business, and we're reinforcing that today in business schools. So there's much more of I think, an interest in these social issues. Two is, and we talked about this in the green room, there's a lot of gridlock in politics right now. And when people look at what's going on in government at the federal, the state, and the local level, a lot of business leaders think that, gosh, it's up to us to step up and try to break some of those log jams and make some things happen. So I think those are a couple reasons why it's happening now.
I gotta ask, because when we think about activism, I think the tendency is to think progressive, subtext progressive activism. CEOs like Tim Cook and you and Mark Benioff standing up for what they see are fundamentally progressive changes, right? But it works in the inverse too. And I'll point out Dan Cathy from Chick-fil-A, who stood up opposing same-sex marriage, and it was a PR and news sensation for Chick-fil-A, but ultimately helped Chick-fil-A's bottom line. So my question to you, Bill, is, how worried are you about the implications of CEOs getting involved in activism in a way that will theoretically engender activism on both sides of the aisle, if you will?
Yeah, I'm not worried at all. Public discourse is the foundation of democracy, and so corporations. Just like elected officials, they face the consequences. It could have gone either way for Chick-fil-A. It certainly could have gone either way for us. In some ways, we had a week or so of dealing with lots and lots and lots of angry people from across the country. But we also had huge support from the other side. That your customers and your shareholders will vote with their feet, and that has that can have benefits. It can have. You're never going to get that far out of where society is, whether it's behind or ahead. It doesn't matter. You're going to operate inside the boundaries of what you can operate.
Ronnie, one of the ways in which it seems like this is sort of the inevitable path forward is not just because there's institutional failure in certain sectors, but also because businesses, it sounds like, tend to be rewarded when their CEOs or when the business itself takes an active stance on an issue, right? So if there's that, and tell us a little bit what you found in terms of how that incentivizes a company to do more of this.
So we looked at the context of Tim Cook speaking out on RFRA along with Bill Osterlick and Angie's List, and we found that not only do CEOs shape public opinion and convince people in that case that RFRA was a bad idea, it also engenders goodwill from customers. So we found that people who agreed with Tim Cook on, let's say, same-sex marriage or LGBT rights were more likely to want to buy Apple products after hearing what he had to say. And that was sort of a revelation for us because, corporations used to be pretty neutral. If you imagine, Michael Jordan has this famous quote in the 1980s where we asked him to get involved in a Senate race in North Carolina. And he said, "Why would I ever get involved on that? Republicans, they buy sneakers too." The issue here was neutrality was better than offending anyone. But now something different seems to be happening where the idea of having the conviction to stand up for what you believe in and willing to put up with the consequences. And you see a shift in a lot of companies. You see that in North Carolina, in Indiana, in Georgia, in all the states where this has happened.
Well, okay, so on one level, this is incredibly heartening, right? And then, and I mentioned this to you guys in the green room where all great conversations happen, that it also has the potential to be sort of terrifying and maybe apocalyptic if the business world follows the same footsteps as Congress. I'll read you a quote from Mark Benioff, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Bill. I think that CEOs today and business leaders are as important as political leaders, and that they have a role like political leaders, which is that they have to stand up for something. When things happen in the world that you don't agree with, as a CEO, you have a responsibility to come forward and say, hey, I don't agree with that because it doesn't support my employees or it doesn't support my customers. Now, we can see that as sort of provocative thinking around positive change, but couldn't we also end up with a partisan business landscape?
Well, I think there probably ultimately is a partisan business landscape. Inevitably, companies benefit from regulation when others are punished in regulatory environments. So, to some degree it is. And again, my own view is you are going to be able to apply case-specific activism. It has to be relevant to your constituents, or it just won't happen. And that will ultimately define when people have a credible voice or when they don't have a credible voice. But I'm not concerned about people expressing their views is fundamentally a good thing. And if CEOs get outside of their own company's views, they tend to have real problems. Either people quit or they get fired as the CEO or they lose customers. And so there are protections in place.
I wonder what you think, Ronnie, about the more the veil is lifted about a company's politics, the more you're going to have brand loyalty that's rooted in something other than the specific product, but a set of ideals, right? So talk to me a little bit about how you see this kind of CEO activism changing the consumer landscape, right?
Yeah,
brand loyalty means something totally different.
Sure. I mean, Alex, there's a revolution now in marketing about personalizing brands, right? Brands want to be your friend. They want to have deep engagement with you. Well, think about this from the political science point of view. Our friendships, our neighborhoods, our schools are more based on political ideology than ever before.
Right.
We sort into neighborhoods and we watch television news shows that accord with our beliefs. Now imagine that a brand wants to be your friend. Well, now taking a political stand, right, being a progressive or conservative, that might be much more important now than it was 20 years ago in establishing a relationship with the consumer. So ironically, some of the partisanship and polarization that we see, right, in the real world might have a huge impact on the way corporations market to people because political ideology is becoming so important.
Right,
I think that's something to watch.
Does that mean you want brand spokespeople who align with your values?
It's possible we could go that direction. I think the results of our study are pointing to something where if you agree with Tim Cook, you're more excited about Apple. And maybe if you agree with Dan Cathy, you're more likely to go to that Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day that Mike Huckabee organized, which was a big part of the response to the backlash. It's the backlash to the backlash that happens, which is interesting. But I will say one thing, for all those folks in the audience who are worried about corporate influence in our politics, Jane Mayer has this new book on the Koch brothers. We have to reconcile, on one hand, that we might be worried or disappointed about sort of corporate influence on the political process on one hand, but on the other, we might cheer CEOs who speak up on causes that we agree with. I think the key difference what I'm seeing with Bill and the things he's done is it's transparent, right? Bill's done this stuff under his own name, and people know who he is and what company he represents, and when it's him and not the company. There is a difference, but that's a kind of an interesting tension to look for as well.
Well, and Bill has done this, by the way, as a Republican. And I want to talk a little bit about the tension there because, on a certain level, going out there as you did on Angie's List and Religious Freedom Restoration Act, you could potentially be at odds with shareholders or some people that work for the same company. You also, in many ways, are at odds with your party on the subject of LGBT rights. And talk to me about how you navigated that and whether there have been repercussions for that.
Yeah, well, there's certainly, I was at odds with a significant portion of the party in the state. There's a division going on in the Republican Party right now, a very dramatic one, the business interests versus the sort of populist interests that have been exacerbated by gerrymandering. I mean, it's really bad. And in states like mine, where there are supermajorities, Republican supermajorities in both houses, the interests of the business community are becoming secondary to the interests of the fundamental right. That was tricky to navigate. We ended up on national Republican, or not even Republican, fundamentalists, website, email rings. I mean, it was.
Did you ever think, should I have done this?
Oh, certainly. Like. Daily, but we were talking a bias to. I had a great board that was supportive, and then our employees. More importantly, the employees. I was holding dialogues with them, and had consistent expressions of support for the position, and that gave me the basis from which to work, But yes, as a Republican, look, progressive. I consider myself. I get called a moderate Republican a lot. I've never been moderate in anything in my entire life.
Well, that's a testament to something else, then, isn't it?
Yeah. But look, when it comes to issues of liberty and and economic opportunity. Those are things that appeal to me about the Republican Party, and having to fight for those a little bit at home these days.
Well, but do you feel like, I mean, and this is part of a larger question, do you feel like one of the reasons you were able to sort of get up and say, this isn't right, is because you felt like that kind of policy wasn't actually representative of the state and its constituents?
There is no question that that's true. Hoosiers are not, I've been there my entire life. And I ran Mitch Daniels' campaign in 2004, so I actually had the polling. I had seen it. I knew what their opinions were. The legislature and the governor were not representing the interests of the people.
Right.
Hoosiers they abhor discrimination, abhor it, and yet the legislature and the governor were portraying the place as one that's comfortable with discrimination, and that I knew fundamentally that wasn't. What Hoosiers are like, and so made it easy.
So I wonder, we are talking about why now, and it feels like this is a case where if part of a system is broken, other branches of the system take the load, and certainly the dysfunction in the legislative branch has bled over into the judicial branch, where the Supreme Court is now effectively a legislative body in many ways. But I see business engagement on these issues as also representative of an institutional breakdown in that area. Insofar as Bill points out, you have state legislatures that are acting not according to the will of the voters or the residents of the state, but because of a small and largely fractious minority that is in charge and crafting policy by and of itself. Mm-hmm. So my question to you, Ronnie, is, if we had a better functioning system at the state level and at the national level, would we see CO activism evaporate?
Well, I think one of the compelling cases for CO activism is that they represent the center in a lot of cases. I mean, Bill's reference to being a moderate. I mean, as you see a historic number of state legislatures and governor's mansions controlled by a single party across different states, we find a situation where you see extreme policies, especially as a result of gerrymandering. And so the center has not held in a lot of these cases. And I think for CEOs like Bill, or former CEOs like Bill and current CEOs, they represent the center and a reasonable voice. I mean, even if you're from a different political party than Bill, when you were listening to him talk about why he stood up, I mean, that was very reasonable. It made a lot of sense. It's the kind of person you might cross party lines to vote for. But those people don't exist as much in our current politics because the party system has sort of killed them off in a lot of ways. And so I think the CEOs can represent potentially that middle ground on some of these issues. I think LGBT issues, gay rights in general, is an important issue for companies because they settled a lot of this stuff, right, with corporate policy in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And so it's a lot easier for Mark Benioff to stand up or Bill Osterley to stand up because they've lived by these things in their companies. On other issues, it's a little dicier. Look at Howard Schultz and Race Together at Starbucks. Trickier issue, right, and arguably not as successful in that case on that particular foray.
The thing that is, I think, cause for consternation is, look, government is always going to have to exist, right, in some fashion. And if we are sort of, in a way, giving up on that system of making a fair, more equitable democracy, I mean, by outsourcing it effectively to the business world or to the bench, what are the implications for government, and how do you foster at least some cross-pollination between the moderate center agents of change, wherever they may be, and people in government tasked with actually carrying that out?
Well, I think it's in crisis that you actually get the cross-pollination. You get the. We stood up because there was a need, and people tend to do that. They're drawn into these discussions when they feel compelled to enter them, and that's what got me involved. It's what got our company involved. It's what got the little organization that Tech for Equality I've put together. All those CEOs, they would be content if everything were going just fine. They've got better things to do, but they're now active and engaged and involved and want to make a difference. So I didn't view what we were doing as somehow propping up a broken process. I viewed what we were doing as participating in improving the process. That's what participation does. So I'm a little more optimistic that this will all work out just fine. More people involved is a better thing, and unless they have something to be involved that moves them, they just tend not to.
Speaking of more people being involved, Bill, I know there's a hunt for an alternative to Donald Trump, maybe a third-party candidacy. Did it ever cross your mind?
Yeah, no. No, I have this friend, Mitch Daniels, that I wish it would cross his mind, or at least I wish he would have run. But But look, the Republican Party's a mess right now. It just is, and it's going to have. Internally, we're going to have to, as a party, resolve that. We're divided on many different levels, and coming down the pike, this immigration issue is going to be very interesting. The business community is in a very different place than much of the traditional party, and it's just going to be fascinating to watch.
With that, we have time for one incredible question. Sir, if you could just start up and let us know who you are, name and affiliation would be great.
Hi, Chris Rollison. How would you think or package this in an overall trend of repersonalizing the economy? I mean, CEOs are not just figureheads of blah, blah, blah company. You're a person. And I see in my work that all aspects of business are becoming personal due to social media.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll let Bill talk from his perspective as CEO. I think Twitter and the ability to communicate directly to your consumers and their constituents is a huge part of this. You've seen a lot of the activism we talked about started on Twitter and really propagated on Twitter. So I think it's undoubtedly part of the story. It's given CEOs a mechanism and a way to speak quickly and clearly. I'm not sure it's the only thing that's going on, but it's a huge part of the story.
Yeah, and I think I agree with the trend. I mean, to the extent that the more companies appear to be talking directly to their consumers, the better it is. It just works in today's sort of marketing, and so I think personalization has a lot to do with this, and to some degree, maybe that's what causes. There have been types of activism for a long time, but maybe that's why corporate activism today is getting a little more attention.
Let me ask you guys one question in closing. From the CEO standpoint, Bill, what's the conversation like among CEOs on this topic?
It's really, it sort of depends on the environment and the audience, but it does come up. The vast majority, the vast majority of CEOs are tunnel vision focused. I mean, business is hard. Like, it is a lot of hard work, and so most of them are intently focused on just whatever the situation is that they're attempting to deal with. They're trying to expand their market. So to be in a if you're in a group of them, you're typically talking about those specific business problems. But if you get in a group of them that share a common, so CEOs in Indiana in the RFRA crisis, you see the best and the worst of like how you want corporate responsibility to flow. Some of it's just, we got to get this over with, whatever it takes. It's got, it must end immediately, and all the way to, no, we've got to fix this for long term, do the right thing. And that's just, it's becoming more apparent as these issues pop up that they're going to have to devote more energy to it. You see people in Indiana hiring government affairs staffs that never had them before, and Tech for Equality, these little tech companies that I'm working with, it never even occurred to them to get involved in things like this, but now they are.
And Ronnie, last question. Is this the inevitable outgrowth of corporate responsibility?
I thought about that a lot as I watched the earlier panels. I do see sort of parallel trends here. I mean, companies have spent a lot of time over the last 15, 20 years quantifying CSR, measuring it, making some really important investments in communities. I think that will continue. I think CEO activism will also continue in response to a lot of these laws that are being passed or considered around legislators. I do think the CEO activism gets a lot of press. I mean, can anyone in the audience name anything that PayPal's corporate social responsibility program has done? And they probably have a robust one, but that their CEO has decided not to create jobs in North Carolina with this activism pitch. So I think you'll see both of them. The CEO activism will get a lot more attention.
And so it goes. Thank you all for your time. Thank you, Bill and Ronnie, for your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Bill, Ronnie. Thank you, Alex. This has been a rich and substantive morning. We started with the view from City Hall, where we heard the deputy mayor say, how you distribute wealth is the big issue we must address. And he says there's urgency and we have to get it right because time is short. We heard the head of corporate responsibility for Hyatt say, when a community we do business in thrives, our business thrives. The Cook County Commissioner, it was an interesting moment. She encouraged everybody in this room to call their HR department to ask what their policy was on hiring people who serve time, with the goal of lowering the bar for people to get over. And finally, we just heard, not only do CEOs shape public opinion, but taking a stand engenders goodwill from customers. A fascinating conversation, to be sure, worthy of much more. We're so grateful to JP Morgan Chase for making this possible, and my thanks to all of you for your time this morning, getting here in the rain. Your time is the best thing that you can give us, but I'm going to ask you for one more thing. On the tables and in your email this afternoon, you will have a short survey from me asking for your feedback about today. Honestly, we pay a great deal of attention to what you say, so if you take a couple of minutes to fill that out, we'd be enormously grateful. Thank you all so much for coming. I think the rain has stopped. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you back here again.